If you're a fan of comics from the late 70s and early 80s, you're definitely familiar with the work of George Perez. He, Frank Miller, and John Byrne were the giants of that era and dominated the sales charts. I've always been a fan of Perez, liked his work, picked it up when I saw it, but never looked too closely at his work and what makes it so popular. Despite so many artists crediting him as a favorite influence, I never saw a lot of his style in other artists the way I could see, for instance, a clear evolution from, say, Barry Windsor Smith to Art Adams to Jim Lee. But I've been researching Crisis on Infinite Earths for my next comic, since it will draw upon a lot of the tropes Wolfman and Perez invented, and taking a closer look at Perez's work was really fascinating. I learned a lot I didn't expect to. I'll get into that, but first, a little background. Here's a breakdown of Perez's career from interviewer L.K. Spearloop in 1982, just as New Teen Titans was at the height of its success. George Perez began drawing comics professionally 9 years ago as an untrained rookie. His subsequent rise to superstardom has been nothing short of meteoric. His and Marv Wolfman's Teen Titans is the best-selling comic in the direct sales market, and Perez himself has become one of the most talked-about young artists in the field. Perez was born in 1954 in the South Bronx. Not having the temperament of a street kid, Perez retreated into the world of comic books and discovered talent for drawing. A formal art education was beyond Perez's family's financial means, so he is entirely self-taught. Perez drew from the age of 5, but didn't give serious consideration to drawing comics professionally until a friend convinced him to attend a comics convention, and the rest, as they say, is history. Perez joined Rich Buckler as an apprentice in 1973, but their approaches to drawing and their personalities didn't mesh. So Perez went solo and was soon drawing Man-Wolf and Sons of the Tiger for Marvel. Perez soon found himself working on the Avengers, the Inhumans, and the Fantastic Four. Due to personal pressures and health problems, he cut his work back to such an extent he had trouble meeting deadlines and maintaining a regular output. His career turned around 3 years ago when Marv Wolfman invited him to do some work at DC. After drawing a Justice League of America story, Wolfman asked him if he'd like to take a crack at a new Teen Titans book. Perez initially thought the book would only last 5 issues, but with its enormous commercial success and the more private professional fulfillment he's found drawing the book, Perez hopes to stay on the Titans through issue 120. That, of course, was from 1982, and Perez would go on to the groundbreaking Crisis on Infinite Earths, as well as classic runs on Wonder Woman, Avengers Again, Brave and the Bold, and Legion of Three Worlds, among many others. Countless others before his passing in 2022. He's one of the all-time greats. And in this video, I'd really like to dive into some of the things that make his art stand out. I'd argue that the thing George Perez is best known for is his knack for putting tons of characters on the page, giving the scenes an epic scope. Initially, it was out of kind of a necessity. As a self-taught beginner, his work wasn't at the level it reached by the early 80s, and he wasn't any editor's first choice. He volunteered for teen books, which take a little longer to do, simply because nobody else wanted him. His pitch to editors and why they should hire him was simply, because you have no one else to do it. That was my one advantage in the group books. No one else wanted to draw the group books, so I volunteered for it. Better getting someone with enthusiasm than a more talented person with none. The group books were something I took because I enjoyed them, but they gave them to me because no one else wanted them. But it wasn't just a lack of options that drew him to teen books. He could have easily stopped them for less challenging assignments as he became a fan-favorite artist. He remarks, "Well, I've been a fan of group books since I've been reading comics. The first book that I actually was a fan of was The Legion of Superheroes, ironically, the only book I haven't drawn practically." Sidebar, this interview was from 1982, and he would go on to draw the Legion in Crisis years later, and then more extensively in the early 2000s in the final Crisis tie-in, Legion of Three Worlds. Back to Perez. I enjoyed group books from the beginning. Maybe it's the interaction, or all the costumes, I don't know. I like having characters interact, and I never get bored with one character, and if I do, I just draw another. I like the soap opera technique you can use when people react when they're talking, open mouth, closed mouth, giving an ugly look, whatever. But it's easy for me. Group books are actually easier for me than a single character, if not time-wise, than staying with it, because I get bored with a single character very easily. If I took a single character book, I'd leave it. Firestorm, while I enjoyed the graphics of the character initially, I did want to get off of it. I was only supposed to be there for 2 issues, and ended up being 4, then 5. But I did want to leave the book because a single character doesn't thrill me as much as a bunch of characters. After Crisis was produced, Marv Wolfman, writer of Crisis and Titans, shared a story about Perez's tendency to add as many characters as possible. He said, "It's his decision to do it that way, no one else's. I designed a cover for George that was supposed to have 3 heads on it, big heads, and something in the middle, I forget what it was. I left George's house, and his wife Carol said to me, 'Are you making it hard for him?' 'No, this is the easiest one in the world. 3 big heads and the blowing up of the earths.' Then I saw the cover. 96 heads, in detail. The man is insane, and he's great. I think his insanity makes him great. He loves drawing lots of figures." Wolfman was right. The result was a memorable cover that's still referenced. Perez's backgrounds are another thing he's well known for, but it wasn't always the case. Starting out, he actually avoided them, saying, "I did not know how to do a continuity of backgrounds. Continuity of figure, momentum from panel to panel wasn't the trouble." I think Marv Wolfman pointed it out, and Marv was one of my harshest critics in the beginning, and I didn't like Marv then either. He knows this, but he constantly got down on me for the weaknesses I had because he was the editor of the Black and White line at the time. In one particular story, The Sons of the Tiger, in Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, there was a bomb on a bridge, and I did not fully establish that there was a bomb there that would go off, so there was no tension involved. And I established a bridge in the very first panel of the sequence, and then never established it again until it blew up, which is a bad sense of place because you have to keep reminding the reader of where he is, where the characters are, and where everything is in relationship to them. So I had to start learning that, and I finally developed that to a fine edge, where I can pretty much keep the character consistent with the background. Eventually, the backgrounds Perez started out ignoring became so important he considered replacing his inker, Romeo Tanghal, on their classic Titans run, over his use of a brush versus a pen for the backgrounds. It had become that vital part of his artwork. He recounts, "The one thing I do enjoy about Romeo is that he's constantly trying to improve. There was a time when I thought the inker should be taken off or I'll leave the book. He was strictly a brush artist, and he learned how to use a pen more for his backgrounds. And I've since asked him to use a pen more, and his backgrounds are superb." Perez's backgrounds have always been my favorite thing about his work. Growing up in the 80s, his backgrounds were the first I ever really took notice of. They were rendered with so much detail, and in a style that recalled advertising and technical illustrations of the time. It really elevated it, and it made the background a part of the story. You could get lost in the detail. When you see a poster or an advertisement done in a comic book style, by advertising illustrators they had weeks to produce what a comic book artist needed to draw in a day. It looked special, something you couldn't see in a comic at the time, unless it was drawn by Perez, who even at 3 or 4 pages a day at times, could produce that level of quality. Another standout aspect of George Perez's art is the unique faces he draws, creating distinctive characters that are important in defining the story, especially in teen books. He outlines his approach when outlining how he differentiated Robin and Speedy in the Teen Titans. "I had to draw him with a totally different look. I changed the shape of his nose. He's got a slightly wider face than Robin does. Doesn't have the cheekbones the Kid Flash has, and his hairline is slightly higher. Little, subtle things like that. His nose was a big thing, and I gave him a very tight lower lip, not a full lower lip the way Robin and Kid Flash have. And that developed a fuller face for him that looks the same when he's Roy Harper and when he's Speedy. That face is always the same because I developed a code for the faces. You can tell from that description how much it mattered to him to get the faces right. This passage where he discusses inkers who would finish his work really also illustrates the importance that held for him. Very few people can match Romeo for his faithfulness to the faces I draw, because he knows them almost as well as I do. I'm very happy with his inking now, but I wasn't for the first few issues. I'm not the only one who's been helping him. Dick Gordiano has been helping him, and you can't ask for a much better teacher than that. I love to ink my own work because I think I have a much better sense of the faces than Terry Austin would. But realistically, if I want to make money, I've always loved his work, and I told that to him. And if he ever wants to work on something, a graphic novel or whatever, I would love to work with Terry Austin. There was a time where I would prefer Terry to Romeo on Titans, but now that Romeo's got it down, I love Terry's work, but Romeo has a sensitivity to the characters. Pablo was a little closer, but he was a little rushed. Ernie was rushed. But I was probably the most pleased with early Collins, which was fine. And Jean Bay was a personal choice for the Changeling issue, and what he lacked in the faces he made up for the same reason that Brett Breeding did, the extra rendering that he did. The only thing that disappointed me was they didn't have Romeo's experience inking my faces issue after issue. Very few people can top Romeo for being faithful to that. I'm probably the only one who will do it better than he does. Now, personally, I have mixed feelings on this. When I was reading his Avengers run in the late 90s, I didn't always like the features he assigned to different characters. Sometimes it just seemed to me like Hawkeye had a weird nose for some reason. And a lot of times, and this is no fault of Perez's, any atypical feature in comics is meant to suggest someone is a villain or their comic relief. It meant something beyond just a varied facial feature. Beyond that, comics are a limited visual language in some ways, and with so many artists using cookie-cutter faces, with only the hair or the body type setting one character apart from another, it sometimes looked weird to see an artist adding something different, however much sense it really made. I felt this way looking at the facial expressions of great artists like Neil Adams or Kevin Maguire. Technically, this is a better approach than the wooden expressions seen in some comic art. Neil Adams has argued that it's ridiculous that comic characters don't always open their mouths while speaking on panel a lot of times. And it's hard to argue he's wrong, but to me, it can seem off if it's taken too far. Comic art is a really unique thing. As readers, we rely on a lot of shorthand that's developed over decades of comic production and reading that's kind of its own language. I'm sure a lot of us have had a relative or a friend looking at a comic and seeing some effect that's perfectly clear to us, and asking, what do those shapes around this character mean? I've heard non-comic readers say more than once that they thought Superman's hair was actually blue, since the blue had been used in the limited pre-90s color palette to represent a lighter shade of black hair. We're really dialed into how comics have been communicating this stuff to us, and when someone does something new, it can take time and more widespread adoption before it seems right. Speaking of comic art seeming right, like 100% comic book artwork, I'm not sure if anyone but John Byrne and George Perez seem like that to me. I'm sure that some of that comes from their art style being dominant when I first started reading, but looking at Perez's art in detail and trying to figure out what made it seem so on point helped me realize something that helped me out a lot creating my own comics. I guess now's as good a time as any to talk about those for just a minute. I'm kicking off We Are Scarlet Twilight Cobalt Crisis early this year, and the link to the pre-launch is just a few scrolls down from this video in the description. If you're a Crisis fan, this comic is for you. It takes the epic events of Big Two crossovers like Crisis on Infinite Earths or Secret Wars, but reimagines what it would have been like if those comics had been produced in comics' golden age, 1930s and 40s, and had all the atmosphere of the old pulps, the Batman animated series of the 90s, or the Fleischer Superman cartoons from 1941. I couldn't be more excited to kick this one off, so get on the pre-launch to be the first to hear when I launch in late February or early March of this year. Oh, and one other thing. I know I love reading my comics on Wednesday right when I pick them up. Issue 1 is going to be drawn and lettered at launch, so if you back, you can message me, get the digital to read that same day. But back to how looking at Perez's art really helped me with my drawing. I realized something about the way he approaches shading I don't think is particularly insightful on my part, but seeing it in Perez's pages really underlined it and made it clear to me in a way that it wasn't before. Shading has become so prevalent in comic art since the late 80s that I always took it as a thing you'd decide from panel to panel. But Perez has a pretty consistent shading style that he uses almost all the time, unless the story calls for a character to be draped in shadow or something like that. His subjects were rendered mainly with lines to define planes, and more heavy shading used to define a more drastic shape intersection, almost like it was lit from straight on. This is the polar opposite of something like Frank Miller's Sin City, which defined shapes 100% by how they interact with the light source from almost anywhere but straight on, and used no lines to describe form at all. Working in 3D and seeing how software like Blender interprets these two methods really helped me understand what was happening there. For instance, here's a Batman model I found online. I think it's from one of the Arkham games. You can set up a shader that takes almost any line definition away, and that's something more akin to Sin City. Using Freestyle, a renderer that gives you line art outputs, creates something more like Perez art. Basically, Freestyle gives you lines for the outline of the shape itself, the silhouette, and then also lines based on this angle number here. It defines how different one face of a model is angled from the next one. If it's lower than the threshold you set, it skips giving you a line for that polygon face. If we set it low, we get our outlines in only the really extreme angle changes, so you have the mouth and areas of high crease from one plane to the next. If we set it higher, you get almost everything. Somewhere in the middle, you get roughly the areas that would be shaded in a Perez painting. It's not exact, isn't good or versatile enough to use as comic art, and obviously Perez wasn't using anything like this to plan his drawings. It came naturally to him, and it's the basic lighting style used by earlier comics legends like Kurt Swan, Dick Sprang, or Jerry Robinson. But seeing how the computer breaks this down, having been familiar with that, and then studying Perez's art, I can see something like the same logic at work. Again, I don't think this is some huge insight on my part. Maybe this has been really obvious to everybody but me. It's something that if I had to explain it earlier, I could, but I hadn't really sat and thought it out to the extent where I could bring it to how I approach my art. That said, just having the framework in my head has helped out my art a ton, and I can see how it really made Perez a fan favorite. First of all, he wasn't reinventing the wheel on lighting every panel, so he could have a consistent output fans could count on seeing month after month, and it gave him time to create all those details we love to see. Second, and this is really just logistically crucial to stories with a lot of characters on the panels, leaving less area and shadow leaves it more open for color, makes it less visually confusing even in a crowded scene. Beyond that, leaving room for the characters' uniform colors and logos to stand out just looks cool. The costumes superheroes have, at least the classic ones, are great just as graphic designs. They're pleasing combinations of color and shape. That's why the good ones have stuck around for so long. I like a bunch of detailed pouches and weapons and straps as much as the next 90s kit. But keeping the costumes simple, at least the iconic ones, and then showing them on panel in ways that feature those costume designs really makes them shine. Plays to the strengths, the classic comic book style and elements. George Perez's art hadn't really been stuff I studied that closely, and I didn't expect to take away so much from digging into it. Keeping some of those lessons in mind when I draw Cobalt Crisis has made my work a lot clearer, a bit better looking, and much, much faster. So I got a lot out of this, and I hope you did too. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Perez illustrated stories are, and if you want to see how his work has inspired a new comic that combines the Golden Age with Big 2 style events that Perez helped pioneer. Head over to that pre-launch page and be notified when I launch early this year. I'll see you next time.